Coming to you live from Austin, Texas, it's the Second Annual Inkling Awards for Literary Excellence. Yeah, whoa, the crowd goes wild. We're back. Happy 2026. I'm sorry I'm late. I know I said at the end of last year that I was going to do this episode before 2025 was up. Well, my friends, the holidays got the better of me. What can I say? I was, in the words of Bob Cratchit, Charles Dickens' indelible character, I was making rather merry with my family over the holidays and did not get around to putting together my second annual list of best books, personal best books from my own reading life. And actually, I think that might be a good thing. I don't know about you, but I like to log off as much as possible in those kind of 2 weeks at the end of the year. I think it's Lindy, as they say. It's traditional to do that. And it might be that this kind of episode on reading, episode about having a reading life, what it means to have a reading life, the worth of having a reading life, will be particularly inspiring to you at this moment when people are doing their New Year's resolutions, a fresh year. There's a line of thought. There's a group of people that kind of don't like the month of January. They think it's the worst month because Christmas is over and you get a little depressed and the holidays were so fun, but you led up to them the whole time. And now it's just blah for the rest of the winter. And I understand that feeling. I will say it's a very good reason to celebrate Christmas the way our ancestors did, according to the traditional liturgical calendar, because if you were doing that, it would kind of even maybe still be Christmas. There's 12 days after December 25th, and then there's a whole season up to February 2nd. So that was part of the point, was to keep the winter bright. And now that we have the Christmas season in the lead up rather than Advent, it's kind of like all the good stuff gets front loaded at the beginning of Christmas, and we don't get anything really to look forward to after that. But having said all of that, I actually don't feel all that blah in the wintertime. I love a fresh, clean new year. And maybe this says more about me than anything else, that I'm kind of a type A person. I don't know. But, you know, the new term begins, school starts back up again for a lot of people. The year is all there before you. Nothing good or bad has happened yet. And you can set these new practices in place. I know some people think, well, if you want to make a New Year's resolution, why not just start healthy practices now? But I think, you know, ritual is important. Markers of time are important. And it's motivating. It's inspirational to have this new, fresh start at the beginning of each year. And that energy kind of comes with me into the new year. So that's how I feel. And I hope you feel that way too. I'm going to look back now on my year of reading last year to kind of reflect what were the things I liked best, what did I think went well, what would I like to do differently as this new year begins and as I start looking ahead to the things I want to read in 2026. So that was the idea always of the Inkling Awards for Literary Excellence, named, of course, after the Inklings, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Owen Barfield, my literary heroes, or some of my literary heroes, and really exemplars for me of what it means to live what I think of as the life of the mind. I always talk about this when people ask me for lists of books that I recommend. You know, what are the 5 books that I need to read to understand Western civilization? Or what's the course of reading that I can go through? Can I pick up the Chicago series of best books? Or do I need to, you know, rifle through some other catalog so that I can be educated and get in on this thing called Western civilization? And I understand the impulse. I think it's a noble impulse, and I welcome that kind of question, but I always annoyingly turn it around by saying it might not be exactly the right question to ask. It might not be that you should be asking how many books do I need to read, but how do I need to be reading and choosing books? Because if you think of it as a list that you need to work your way through, then it's like a one and done, right? You're done with the list and now you've read things, right? And what you'll soon discover is that there's always more to read, and reading in the deepest sense is actually a way of life. It's a practice. It's a habit. And so in this podcast, which is all about the great works of Western civilization, the classical education that you didn't know you were missing, I like to kind of return to this idea again and again, that if nobody's told you this, maybe, or if reading has always seemed like a kind of mystical practice that you want to get into, there's really nothing all that mystical about it. It's just like going to the gym. You have to get your reps in, and gradually, no one set is going to transform your world, but over time, with consistency, you can make rapid, or major, I should say, major changes. And they don't feel rapid, but they actually do build up pretty quickly over a pretty short space of time. And then the habit itself becomes the point. It's one of these intrinsic goods that as you develop the taste for it, you'll start to look forward more and more to the moment of solitude when you can be with your book. And this is something I'm thinking about a lot these days, because one reason why I'm late with this episode is I'm teaching this term. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see that I'm not in my usual office in Nashville. I'm out here at the University of Austin, UATX, and I'm teaching two courses. One is a kind of a survey seminar on the passages from the Old Testament, followed by dialogues from Plato, followed by selections from Aristotle. And the focus of that course is wisdom. It's all about what is wisdom and how does it stretch across different traditions, and what do the canonical foundational texts of the West have to say about it. And then I'm teaching a small seminar about the Republic. We're reading Plato's Republic together and discussing it in detail. And man, I have to say, I'm having the time of my life. I love teaching, and I love these students in particular. They're so smart, so eager, and so insatiable. It's really a privilege as an educator when you have a group of students who want to know more, who are there to be in it with you. And then it just becomes about how much you can give them. It's not about trying to get something, trying to elicit kind of curiosity from the students. It's about offering them more and more to contemplate and think about and grow with. And to me, there's just basically nothing more gratifying than to be in that position. So I've been really kind of digging into the community here and getting to work on the courses and making sure that I have all the stuff kind of lined up, which is why I haven't recorded an episode. But another really cool thing about UATX is that they are a fully modern, they're a new university. And so there's also a lot of fantastic kind of tech amenities, including this studio where they're very kindly allowing me to record. So for this term, at least, I will be coming to you from the University of Austin, Texas. If you had asked me, like, at the end of grad school, okay, Spencer, you have all these criticisms of the way that academia is going. How would you fix it? I think that UATX is like a pretty good approximation of what I would have come up with. Like, they are making a go of restoring the best of what it means to do a liberal arts education. So I'm very proud and pleased to be part of that. There's also exciting kind of live debates going on about how that is supposed to work, right? What is a university supposed to be? We know it's failed, right? We know that the Ivies have been suffering from serious problems, that ideological capture and wokeness have kind of taken over the university. But what does it mean to fix that problem, right? What would a better version look like? And I think there's one danger, which is just to do the same thing, but in reverse, right? To be kind of the right-wing version of what the left has done with some of our more established universities. And I think a more exciting thing to ask is, what would it mean to reestablish a university that is for the sake of wisdom unto itself, that is for Sophia, right? Which is this Greek word for the highest kind of knowledge, and then to kind of take all of those other forms of knowledge and guide them with wisdom. That is part of the conversation that's going on here. And it's very, very cool to be having that conversation in real time, because for so long, so many of our universities have just given up on this at all altogether, right? Now, that doesn't mean there aren't open questions, right? And turbulence and like messiness in the life of trying to figure this out, right? The life comes with like difficult questions of how to allocate resources and which courses to teach and all of that. But you would rather have those questions, right? And that messiness and be figuring that out than have death, right? Than just have the slow decay that we've seen in so many of our other universities. So one of the things that's kind of relevant to this episode about reading and about how to do the life of the mind well, is that I notice there's kind of two things that people are concerned with here. One is, how do we plug back into the vein of our best traditions, right? How do we restore the Western canon in a way that is not closed off, that's not small-minded, but does maintain an idea that there is such a thing as a canon, right? That there is the best that has been thought and said, that we stand to benefit from it and we should learn it and understand it. There's that side of it. And then there's also like a very forward-looking side of it, which is, how does all of this operate in 2026 and beyond, in a world where AI is kind of threatening maybe to replace so much of this and to kind of overturn much of what we knew about language and how language works. And that too is something I've been thinking a lot about. So, we're kind of engaging with that as well. I mean, I am realizing as I'm thinking through this stuff that my approach is kind of not so much moderation, but maximalism in both directions. So you might say, well, we should have a little bit of kind of modern AI stuff, and we should have a little bit of old-fashioned, techno-pessimism. We should have a little bit of old-fashioned, just like sitting and writing by hand. And I think we should have a lot of both. We should have both to the max. C.S. Lewis, when he talks about the idea of the chivalric knight, says he's not like a little bit gentle and a little bit violent and strong. He's both to the nth. That is, he combines them both, and he doesn't dilute one thing with another. And so I really think like you want to be, as a student, but also as a person in the world facing these modern challenges, you want to be diving into AI and figuring out how it can work, what it can and can't do, learning to use it. You don't want to be hiding your head under a hole and just ignoring it and pretending it'll go away. But you want to be doing that as like as one project, right? For example, myself, I'm learning how to use AI as part of my research, right? And how I can catch it out in its mistakes and how I can use it to help me by getting new information that I wouldn't otherwise have. But that's sort of one side of things. And then the other side of things is going all the way in the direction of like no tech at all. So if you have some instruction courses study that are about like, how do I operate in the most advanced way in the modern world, you should also have some time where you're putting your phone away, you're reading a paper book, you're writing by hand, you're doing oral exams, right? All of those things. And for me, and this is just obviously my own kind of, you're not going to be surprised that this is the way I view things. You should be focusing on the tech-free version of things first. That should be your primary kind of core skill set, because that will enable you even to use the tech better. In other words, you will be a smarter user of AI if you have first trained yourself to operate without AI. That's why people who grew up before the smartphone are, I think, better at using their smartphones than people who were always immersed in smartphone technology. You have to train kind of your base layer capacities, your base skills, and those are the ones that you get kind of built in, right, that are ingrained in you as a human naturally, and you move up from there into greater degrees of artificial stuff. You're learning to use first handwriting, taking exams by hand, right, but then learning to type, then learning to read on a Kindle, then learning to research online, then learning to do AI stuff, right? I think that that's how it should work. It should be like a kind of concentric circle model where you're doing the tech-free stuff and then you're growing out to the AI stuff, but you should be focusing on both with like equal intensity. You should want to be hyper-modern and also good at reading a book and sitting quietly in contemplation. Not just because those things are good in themselves, I do believe that obviously, but also, and this is key, right? if it's true that AI is going to reshape our economy and transform the way that we, say, think about the law profession, right? If it's true that going and doing legal research is something that AI will be very involved in from here on out, then one thing that's bound to happen is you're going to have a whole employment market that is flooded with people who have only ever used AI, right? Just like now we're starting to see all these people who can't read a book, who have only ever scrolled on their phones, right? Who have grown up sort of surrounded with smartphone tech. We are probably going to see generations now that haven't done what I'm talking about, haven't trained their base layer skills, and are only able to use AI and therefore don't know what AI can't do and don't see when AI is showing them kind of a partial picture. They don't know what they don't know. And what that is going to mean is that it will create scarcity, and scarcity always creates a premium, and that will create more value for the people who know how to operate without AI as well as with, right? It will mean that one of the most valuable skills you can have on the job market going forward will be sustained attention and focused thought, the ability to sit with your thought, to focus on one thing and one thing only for a long time will become more and more rare and will become more and more valuable because it does have incredibly major benefits, right? The focused flow, as they sometimes call it, right, is something that will always be useful for the highest levels of thought. And one of the best ways to train it is by developing a reading habit, right? Reading turns out to still have some core benefits that other technologies can't give you. The ability to just like sit with yourself, to think, to string out, to write by hand and string out a series of thoughts that goes from an introduction all the way to a conclusion, right? Starting at this point, making a point after that, making the next point, right? And then drawing a conclusion, logical argumentation. All of this is stuff that you develop through reading, through a reading habit. So although I'm not a doomer about AI, although I don't think it's all bad, I do think that if we're not careful, it will degrade our capacities in the other stuff that we used to be able to do. I can't find my way for anything in a city anymore because I use my iPhone maps, right? And that's because I've just allowed that ability, that natural ability to degrade. You don't want to do that with your reading ability because your reading ability is core to your thinking ability, core to your own process of coming up with ideas and stitching ideas together on your own. And you need to be able to do that even to use AI well. So reading is like urgent as well as, I think, fun and beautiful and good in and of itself, right? And so I will always recommend, and this is something I've said before on the podcast, but I want to repeat it. When people come to me and they say, how do I get into reading? How do I start to become conversant in the Western canon? I have Dr. Klavan's 30-30-30 prescription for the whole soul. And this is like, it's not a list of books. It's a habit. It's a practice, right? It's something that you can get into doing every day. And I think you can get into doing it pretty easily with pretty low cost and barrier to entry. So it's called 30-30-30 because I think it's 3 things you should spend 30 minutes on every day. So an hour and a half total. And each of these 3 things is keyed to one of the 3 parts of the soul. You've maybe heard me say before that in Plato's Republic and other subsequent texts, right, the soul has at least 3 parts or aspects. It has, roughly speaking, the head, the heart, and the gut. So it has your ability to think and reason and discern order in the world. That's your logos, or your mind. Then there is your thumos, which is your ability to carry out your plans, to stick to your guns. It's where your courage lives. And then you have the sort of appetites, right? The epitheumatikon, it's sometimes called, or even maybe tophytikon, the kind of natural desires and impulses that you have. And that's your gut, right? That's the stuff that you just want. And those aren't bad, but they are irrational until they are guided by the logos, until they're guided by your mind, and until your mind's commands are put into practice by your thumos, by your willpower. And then you start to have what is called moderation, right? Or sophrosyne, a kind of right arrangement of things. And when all of these cylinders are firing together, then you have justice, a kind of justice within the soul, that you are a friend to yourself, as Plato's Socrates famously says. So you need to train each of these three parts in their respective ways, in their respective disciplines. And a way to do this, right, is to adopt sort of three different practices. So we have this idea, right, of the tripartite soul. And we also have a similar, although slightly different idea, right, in the Bible and especially the New Testament, that you are a body, a mind, and a spirit, right? That you have a physical dimension to you, you have a cognitive or an intellectual dimension to you, and you have a spiritual or a theological dimension to you. And if you're not a practitioner of a religion, you can think of this as kind of your engagement with the highest things, right? The direction of your soul. And so these three things all need training, and that's what the 30-30-30 method is for, right? You spend 30 minutes training each of these parts of you. The first one, right, the body, is trained by exercise, right? And you don't want to neglect this. You don't want to just think that you can kind of siphon off the other two parts and be this floating spirit. No, you are an embodied soul, and so you got to lift weights, you got to go out in nature, you got to climb, you got to run, swim, jump, whatever, for 30 minutes at least a day, right? And these are all minimum. And I say minimum because if you set up this rule, if you do this as a minimum, then you will quickly develop a taste for it. And this is the secret. Don't try to kind of enforce some vast, some vast program upon yourself where I'm going to go for, a 10-mile run every morning or whatever. That's the way that you fail, right? That's how to do New Year's resolutions wrong, because you start out with all this motivation and then the motivation dies down and you kind of give it up, right? Instead, you start by enforcing discipline, not motivation, discipline. I'm going to do 30 minutes, let's say, of lifting weights every day. And then you let love start to catch on. Then you let that acquired taste start to build. And pretty soon you'll probably be trying to get in more. But you always have that lowest baseline, right? Where you're never going to go less than 30 minutes. But you're pretty quickly going to want to do more because working out feels good. Getting results feels good. It doesn't feel good at first, but gradually you're going to learn, right? That's the first 30. The next 30 for the soul is prayer, meditation, some kind of spiritual practice. I don't think you can neglect this, even if you're not like me and you don't have a particular religious denomination, right? So I have a set of doctrinal commitments that is not part of the bare minimum here, right? It's a bigger to be what I am, which is like an Anglican Christian, is to have a whole bunch of ideas about what the right spiritual practice is that I'm not saying you need to adopt right away. But you do need to spend some time in contemplation of that which is higher than you. And you need to do that through meditation or through prayer or even perhaps through a certain form of slow meditative reading, right? Something, whatever that looks like at your current stage, you got to foster and develop that. And I think, and certainly hope, that it will grow in the same way, that you will start to develop a taste for that, because you actually can't operate well, you can't act well unless you're able first to sit in stillness, to meditate upon the silent ground of all speech, right? And so what you need to do in that is you need to basically develop your practice of sitting with whatever discomfort, with whatever yearnings and longings, with whatever confusion you may have, and offering it up to God. Then you will be better at acting, right? It's just like when you have to learn to use a technology, first you have to learn to operate without it. In order to operate well in the world, you have to first be able to find that place in yourself which is connected to something beyond this world. That's the spiritual part. And then finally, the part that this episode is about, the mental, the intellectual part. And this is 30 minutes of reading a day. So 30 minutes of phone down. I don't care when it is. If you have to wake up 30 minutes earlier, if you have to cut 30 minutes of Netflix, boo-hoo, out of your life, right? It will feel maybe painful at first to try and carve this time out, but the pain is the entry cost of the joy that is waiting for you on the other side, right? So you're going to spend 30 minutes reading, at least reading something, and a paper book ideally with your phone away. In fact, definitely with your phone away, right? And with no other distractions. Turn off your notifications, all that stuff. Now, what should you read? Not all books are created equal. I'm not as much of an egalitarian as some people are about this. I think some text is better than no text, but there are good lists available online. I quite like the one put out by the University of Chicago, but start with something that you know you need to read. I mean, the Bible, even if you're not religious, is something you need to read to be educated. The kind of core tetralogy of the Platonic dialogues that includes the Apology and the Euthyphro and the Crito, all right, and the Phaedo. You got to read that. So you might start with that. And what you'll find is that reading is probably the one of these practices that is most contagious. And everything you read sparks some idea that you want to read something else, right? Something else that you think you might need. And let that guide you and let that love start to grow. And it becomes a practice and a habit. And you can listen to old episodes of this podcast or the new ones that we're going to do on Dante in this coming year. You listen to other people's podcasts. You can search online, whatever. I don't care. Just start that habit. And I promise it will start to grow, because the love and the joy of it is so refreshing in this world where you're like always scrolling, where you're always on your phone, right? Forcing yourself into 30 minutes away from all of that is like drinking cool water suddenly on a hot day in a drought, right? Suddenly you start to taste that, and you're going to want more, and you're going to build up the muscle. You're going to build up the discipline to get a certain degree of detachment from your machines, which leads me to another question and kind of feeds into this next thing, which people also ask me, which is, how many books should I expect to read, right? How much should I be reading? And boy, does this get fraught online. People have these arguments a lot, especially at the end of the year when people start to post their list of books that they've read. And this blew up on Twitter, if you're on Twitter. And then another reason why I'm kind of glad to have waited for this to die down is we can reflect on this a little bit. There was a bunch of stuff. First of all, there were some young women posting stacks of books, like over 100 books, 140 books I read this year or whatever. And you zoomed in, and a lot of these books were romantasy, right? They were a kind of, they were this new genre. And I say new because, there's been romance novels for a long time, but there's been a real increase in popularity for these very, very explicit fantasy novels that get like really, really crazy. And I know that people think like, well, at least it's fiction. At least people are reading something. Some of this, I have to tell you, every book is different, but some of these books I've looked into for science, and they really are pornographic. I mean, there's a degree of kind of repetitiveness, titillation. They clearly exist for the sake of the sex scenes rather than the sex scenes serving the narrative. And I think that, this is why I say not all books are created equal. So these people who kind of churn through these books, sometimes you feel like, actually, that's maybe more of a porn addiction than a reading life. On the other side of this, you have a tweet that went viral, which some guy at, Born to Pay, I've never heard of this person before, but he says over 30 books a year is consumerist and anti-intellectual. And so then there was this whole argument about policing how many books people read, how many books you should read, how fast or how slow you ought to read. And there is a level at which when somebody says, like, I read 100 books this year and it's all like, Atomic Habits and Thinking Fast and Slow, I'm like, well, you're probably not doing the thing that we mean when we talk about reading. You're probably doing something more like information gathering, which will be replaced by AI. Like, that is something that you can get AI to summarize those sorts of books for you. But on the other hand, it's very difficult and probably not helpful to set a particular number, because different people at different times in their life read at different speeds. And really, the truth of the matter is you should read at exactly that speed that you read at, where you can digest and ruminate upon and internalize what you are reading. And that will be different even for different books, right? When I read contemporary novels, I read many more pages at a time than when I read even a very short Platonic dialogue. I'm working right now on a poem by Heretics called The Phenomena. It's, just over 1,000 lines long, and I've been reading it for a month, because I'm trying to read it carefully. And so the whole question actually seems a bit like a red herring, a bit like a dead end. I like to think of this slightly differently. The way I like to think of it is not about how fast am I supposed to read this year, but rather, how many books do I reasonably have to read before I die. Read as if you're going to die is actually a more helpful principle for me. And just for the sake of it, just for the sheer kind of lark of the thing, I talked to Grok about this. I went on Grok, which is one of the AI chatbots that a lot of people use, and I said, how many books can a 35-year-old man reasonably expect to read in the rest of his lifetime before he dies? And Grok performed a few like back of the napkin calculations. I probably could have performed these calculations myself, but it was relatively entertaining to see what it thought. And it gave me like a range, right? So it says, this is something, it feels morbid to talk about, but this is something that people used to think about all the time. And we've gotten unused to engaging with this, right? Like, I am going to die. I'm going to die, hopefully not immediately after shutting off this podcast, but maybe, you never know, right? Optimistically, and this is sort of where Grok landed me, right? Like, I can hopefully count on 45 more years of life. I hope I can count on more. I always say that I'm trying to be not the world's most successful 35-year-old, but the world's most successful 90-year-old. So, maybe I live to 90 and I have 55 more years. But right, that's the amount of time that I have. And so within that time, right, if I'm reading very, very slowly, you might imagine me reading like 20 books a year. If I'm reading really, really fast, you can imagine me reading like 100 books a year. Usually for me, with the variety of material that I read a lot of different things, I end up in the 40s somewhere, right? So going with that figure, going with the figure of about 40 books a year, you can imagine me reading, say, 1,600 to 1,750 more books in my lifetime before I die. And I have a lot of hope that I'll keep reading after I die, but I don't know that, right? I don't know what heaven is like. I don't know what the afterlife is like for sure. So it's a safe bet to say I've got 1,750 more books to read. That is not many books. It's not a lot of books, right? So there's going to be a lot of things that come out that I might enjoy reading. In fact, I am daily confronted with the tragedy of how many things I want to read, but probably will never get around to. What I need in my life is the books that are going to make those 45-ish years most rich. And I obviously can't do that with a mathematical formula, but I find it a very helpful guiding question because it kind of leads me into thinking, well, like, is this something that is worth a spot on the 1,700 books that I'm going to read before I die? And I've been trying to think that way for some time. And it has really helped, I think, to make my reading lists look better at the end of the year to me. I feel very satisfied with the books that I read in 2025. There were some duds, no question, but there were also a lot of things I read for work, but things I also read for pleasure. I had a rule in 2025 that I only read novels on the weekend so that I would have some lively prose to kind of cut in between the dry academic stuff that I have to read. And between those rules, I actually feel like I got a really good list, and I feel like I developed my reading life, right? Which is actually the goal. The goal is not to get to that number 1,750 or whatever. The goal is to maximize the quality and the richness of my life of reading, because it's part of life. It's like breathing, right? It's just part of what it means to be going through my life. And the reading itself is the point, right? I'm wanting to read types of books that AI couldn't summarize for me. Or if AI could summarize them for me, it would be pointless, right? Novels are the classic example. If you could have AI summarize the novel Bleak House, it wouldn't do anything for, like, do you want AI to look at a sunset for you and tell you what it's like? Do you want AI to eat your food, right? That's the kind of book that I want to read, the book that will fill the precious, countable few hours of my life with something that nothing else could give me, right? Which is that experience of connecting with another mind. And so it's with that in mind that I'm very pleased to present the best books in each category, the Inkling Awards for literary excellence of 2025 that I read over the past year. You may remember, if you have been around with me for some time, that I introduced these categories last year when I did the best books of 2024. I'm going to stick with the same categories, but I am going to cheat and give you some runners up because who doesn't like more book recommendations? But I'll start with nonfiction. So best nonfiction is the first Inkling Award, and the Inkling Award goes to, drum roll, the best nonfiction that I read in 2025 was Why Only Us by Noam Chomsky and Robert Berwick. I think I'm saying that right. I'm not actually sure how to say Berwick's last name. But this was a very profound work for me. It was part of my research. I'm writing a book about language and how language makes us human. So this was an obvious choice. It's about why only humans have language. And it's about why in two different senses, at least. It's about why that happened evolutionarily, why it might be that language only evolved one time. And it's about why that is true, why that's a defensible claim, why the things that animals do besides us, right? Why the things that birds do when they sing, for example, aren't the same fundamentally as what we do when we speak. This is a highly technical piece of literature. It's probably not going to be for everybody. If you don't want to churn your way through the whole thing, there's a great review of it by Stephen Barr in First Things that you can also find just on their website, which might be a kind of worthy summary. He's a very lucid interpreter of scientific texts. But if you're up for it, it is quite astonishing to read these two, so far as I know, secular linguists, evolutionary neuroscientists and linguists, poring over what is now a wealth of evidence about what makes human language essential, what makes it fundamental to our species, and what makes it distinctive. Because one of the things they uncover is that human language is first and foremost a kind of interior way of seeing. It's a way of thinking and organizing the world and discerning structure in the world. So if you're like me and you're of a philosophical or theological mind, you can just see the logos, right? You can just see these classical ideas that we have from the Bible operating at this very granular level in the research that Chomsky and Berwick are doing. They probably wouldn't agree with me about that, which is one of the joys and pleasures of reading, right? Not everybody that you read is going to have the same framework or perspective as you, and that often will enrich your own understanding of how your perspective works. Because just because they don't think that the logos is alive, right, doesn't mean that they haven't discerned and uncovered things about the logos that nobody else could have done. So why only us? Runner up, if you are not big into this, if this sounds like a snore to you. I also read a new translation of Caesar's Gallic Wars because I was reviewing it for the Claremont Review of Books. I will link to that review. It's not the translation that I'm recommending. It's just the Gallic Wars because, man, what an astounding book. I mean, if you think about the fact that Julius Caesar, you've heard of him, right? You know, the guy who basically turned Rome into an empire, the dictator for life, whose heir, Augustus, became Rome's first emperor, that he wrote war memoirs, field reports, right? That we actually have his firsthand account of his campaigns is astonishing enough. And then the fact that for the Gallic War specifically, it's actually the campaign that made him into who he would become, right? He was not yet dictator for life when he fought in Gaul. What he was doing was trying to serve the Republic by managing its provinces in the area of what's now France. And they were pretty small when he went over there. And then in a very, very short space of time, there was just a series of events that he used to conquer the whole of what is now France. And what's amazing about it, especially, is that that wasn't a region, right? There was a bunch of different tribes that occupied that space. And he was the one who famously said, Gaul is a whole divided into three parts, right? He was imposing this map upon it, even as he was making that map a reality by conquering it. Caesar is, a famous hate object and love object throughout history. There have been all kinds of different understandings of him. But whether you love or hate him, whether you think he was the villain of history or one of the heroes of Rome, right? it is amazing to have this insight into his mind and strategy and to look at how it was that he gained the adoration of his soldiers, which would eventually enable him to win the civil wars, or at least to score a decisive victory in the civil wars. There was still more civil conflict to come after he crossed the Rubicon. But, the force of personality, the magnetism of character, and above all, the allegiance he commanded is breathing on every page of this work. So if you have not read this short and readable work of firsthand history about the making of a world historic man, boy, you got to read Gallic War. The Landmark edition, if you can spring for it, is really cool because it has all these like maps and notes and stuff. But the New Loeb translation, which is the one I review, is also pretty serviceable. So that's nonfiction. Congratulations to Noam Chomsky and Robert Berwick. I know they're going to be thrilled to hear. The committee has notified them, and they will be receiving their statuette in the mail. That's the best nonfiction. Goes to Rob Chomsky and Berwick. And now, drumroll please, for best fiction that I read this year. I should say that this is the one category where I try to keep things as contemporary as possible. It doesn't have to be written this year, but fiction is something that I think really can reveal the heart of a moment and convey something about what's going on now. So I like to try to keep abreast of some contemporary fiction. In the other categories, it could be Noam Chomsky or it could be Julius Caesar, right? I'm doing whatever time period I might have happened to be in. But with fiction, I try to do contemporary stuff. And this time I'm doing something, I'm cheating a little because this is not a brand new book, but it is being made into a brand new movie, and that is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Andy Weir is a very popular science fiction writer. He wrote The Martian, which also got made into a movie with Matt Damon. I liked the movie. I actually haven't finished the book The Martian, although I started listening to it. But this one I read in written form. And man, how to describe this novel without spoiling it. I guess the first thing to say is if you haven't read The Martian if you haven't read Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir, read it now before the movie comes out, because the movie has already, don't even watch the trailer, because the trailer already spoils one of the big reveals. I understand why they did it. It makes a lot of sense. That reveal that I have in mind is one of the draws, no doubt. People are going to come to this movie because they know about a certain thing that happens halfway through the story. But I will never reproduce precisely the feeling I had when this twist happened. And it was like the bottom dropped out of the story, and it was this vast new adventure that you didn't know you were in. And it recreates so precisely. I think this is the closest I've ever felt to imagining that I knew what it was like to be in outer space. The opening scene, right, our protagonist, who's kind of this nerdy science teacher, wakes up and realizes that he's in outer space. And you have to kind of slowly piece together what's going on, why he's there, what he's there to do, and it turns into this galactic adventure. But the other thing about it is that Weir's hero, and this is true of him in general, Weir's hero is much more human than some of the heroes you get in sci-fi. This is not just a thought experiment. This is also a character drama. And I just came to love this picture of lovable nerd masculinity. It is a very male book about a male character. And yet it's not about a kind of chest-thumping hero. It's about a very, very flawed and in some cases squirrely kind of dork who nevertheless is charged with saving the day. One of those books you got to read before the movie comes out. I think you should always read the book before you see the movie, but this one in particular, you'll never recapture the feeling of these twists that Weir kind of weaves through the story. Runner-up in this category is one that's not going to be for everybody, and that's why it's the runner-up. And it's called House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, I think is how you say his name. And it's a big old book. It's expensive, hardcover, but you have to buy it in the format that it comes in because it's a very postmodern horror novel. It's a horror novel where the book itself is kind of the monster. That's the best way that I can describe it. The basic plot is really easy to describe. It's about a house that has a portal to the void in it. You open this particular door and time and space breaks down and you go deeper and deeper into this place where all truth, all identity unravels and is consumed. So you can just like go in to discover the realm of death, basically, the realm of unbeing. But the way that the book works is that as people experience that unraveling, as characters experience it, the structure of the book also starts to unravel. And it has all these different layers of like, it's a story about a movie, it's a story about a book, about a movie, right? And all of that starts to get like basically scattered and transformed. And I was reading it right as my house was being demolished because we're doing some renovations in my home. And it was crazy to read this book that is supposed to reproduce the experience of going into a house that has a void at the center of it. And while I'm doing that, every time I walk downstairs in my house, there's like another wall that's been taken out. So the shape of my room is changing and the shape of the floor plan is constantly shifting. So that was a trip, and I can't guarantee that you will have that experience, but there are a few genuine jump scares that made my heart kind of leap up into my mouth in this book. So if that sounds appealing to you, you should definitely check it out. It's a really cool concept novel. I wouldn't recommend that every author try it, but Danielewski pulls it off, I think, pretty well. So that's the best fiction. Congratulations, Andy Weir. I know you've been waiting for this honor because you haven't had enough accolades. It's fine, I guess, to have blockbuster movies made out of your books, but have you won an Inkling Award? Now you have. Congratulations, Mr. Weir. Okay, the next category is criticism. Best criticism. And this is writing about writing in some kind or another. And this is a specific art. It's an art that makes up a lot of what I personally do, so I have kind of a professional interest in it. And I think it's maybe a bit of a lost art. It's the kind of thing that you will only be interested in if you already have a life of reading, right? If reading is something that you love to think about and talk about and do, then criticism is something you will like to read because you'll like to read smart people talking about great works of literature and shaping your own thoughts and helping you to understand your own reactions. Last year, I think the winner was T.S. Eliot, who's hard to beat. He had a book of criticism on poetry that I just loved. It showed me so much, especially about Virgil. But this year, it's a more contemporary critic, Peter Stothard, who is a British scholar, academic, but also literary figure. He was editor of the Times literary supplement for a while. And he wrote a biography of the Roman poet Horace. It's called Horace, Poet on a Volcano. And just on a professional level, I admired what Stothard does in this book so enormously much. If you try to write nonfiction, and you try to write nonfiction that people will read besides just like the select group of people that like your subject. That is, if you try to write what they call trade books, non-scholarly literature that is still about intellectual subjects, you very quickly learn that it is a profoundly perilous business to take something you know a lot about and distill it into something that people will like. Because, look, I love to bore my friends and family with arcane minutiae about, say, Proto-Indo-European, right? That is a thing that, unfortunately, if you know me, I will do that to you at some point. It's one of the things I love about teaching is that that's kind of part of the job, is to like explain things in great detail. But you can't ask every reader to be as nerdy and excited as you at the granular level that you have to get to write a book, right? You can invite people into your nerdiness, no doubt. And that's part of what writing a nonfiction book is. But inevitably, to write a book, you are going to have to learn way, way more and want to learn way, way more than can ever fit into the book. And that means you're going to have to summarize, and you're going to have to do it, hopefully, in a way that is beautiful, artful, right? That is narrative and compelling and has like good prose features that you would also enjoy in fiction. And the more you do this, right, the more you have to slide back and forth on this scale between accuracy and beauty. And it's all about that negotiation of trying to combine both of those things, trying to make accuracy and beauty live together. And inevitably, you will always be accused of leaving some stuff out. You will always be accused of oversimplifying by people that know the subject well, or you'll be accused of going too deep into the weeds by people that don't know the subject. And it's really, really hard to strike that balance. And Stothard does such a wonderful job with that in Horace. Horace himself is a difficult poet. He's somebody that when you pick him up sight unseen and read him for the first time, there's going to be a lot of allusions. There's going to be a lot of weird like turns of phrase that you're not familiar with, a lot of historical context that you need. And so actually a biography like this is really important to have as you start to read Horace. And Stothard just gives you what we know about this man's life, which was very dramatic because he lived during that period of transition from republic to empire when a lot of the great poets of Rome lived. This was also, he was a contemporary of Virgil and, of Tibullus and a bunch of other names that you might have heard of. And he had a kind of low profile, or he was like sort of the nebbish. He was the shabby guy. He was famously fat, and he kind of wove in and out of these halls of power. He did not come from riches. He was the son of a freedman, of an ex-slave. And it's just such a great like rags to riches story. He's such a humane character to get to know. And once you read Stothard's book, you actually get better at reading Horace's poetry. So I just hat off to him, man. As a fellow traveler in this field, like really admired what Stothard does, and well worth reading that book. Okay, there's no runner-up in that category because I liked that book so much, and I actually didn't interestingly read that much criticism this year. I read some, obviously, but not a ton of books of criticism. A lot of essays, I guess, of criticism. But the next category and the final one, because this is the queen of disciplines, is best work of theology. And theology, again, like not everyone reads it. I think everyone should, even if, again, you don't have a particular doctrine that you subscribe to, you definitely should be reading and thinking about and considering arguments about the divine, whether you are committed to one faith or not. This is something that should interest you. What is mankind's ultimate end? What is the highest purpose, right? And that includes even like, I would count works by atheists as works of theology. If they're trying to persuade me of atheism, right, they are talking about these matters of highest import. And so like this is just part of that spiritual dimension of your life that you want to cultivate. And so for me, the best work of theology this time around is actually a little bit unexpected. Maybe I'm cheating, but you can decide. The best work of theology I read was Dante's De Vulgari Eloquentia, which technically is not theology, but linguistics. In fact, it could arguably be called the first work of Western linguistics. Dante does some things in this book that are totally unprecedented. He invents the categorization system that is eventually going to become the idea of the Romance languages. He's writing at a time when Latin is still the common currency of the elite and of the intellectuals, but he's starting to see, Latin is no longer really a living language. Like there are all these other languages that are descending from it, and they have these different forms, right? So he starts out, he's like, there are different words for yes in these different languages. There's si, like in Italian. There's uk, like in certain parts of France, and there's or oui in other parts of France. And this is why we still have a region in France called the Languedoc region. It means Languedoc, like the language of uk, where they say uk for yes instead of oui. So he's drawing this linguistic map of Europe that's never been drawn before. And at the same time, and this is why I call it a work of theology, he's putting forward an anthropology of the word. He is arguing that humans are uniquely poised to have language because they are fully rational beings. They're beings that can communicate with divine logos, but we are also embodies. That is, we can't just beam our thoughts into one another's heads like he thinks the angels can do. We can't just mingle our spirits. We have to translate our abstract thoughts into sounds, images, gestures, right? And that's what language is. So is this wonderful passage about the way that angels must communicate, the way that beasts communicate, and how what humans do is kind of in the middle of those two things. He has one of the most original interpretations of the Tower of Babel story that I've ever read. And it's, again, a short book, a little book, all about how we should really care about the vulgar tongues, that is to say, the languages that people speak naturally, rather than just Latin. The book is cleverly written in Latin, but it's arguing against the supremacy of Latin. Dante talks about the prima lingua, the first language we speak, which is the one we learn from birth, and that's our mother tongue, and so that's where we write poetry best. And of course, he's gearing up to write the Divine Comedy, which is going to definitively make vulgar poetry in the vulgar languages into something people take seriously. So it's a major work, a kind of neglected work in the history of the West, and I think a work of sublime theology. If that's too cute for you, I do have a runner-up in this category, and that's Jerome's Hebrew Questions on Genesis, which is definitely about theology. It's about the interpretation of the book of Genesis from the guy who translated the Bible into Latin. So this is way before Dante, back when Latin is becoming the common currency of Europe. Jerome is creating a translation of the Bible into its Latin form, the Vulgate, right? And back then, Latin was the vulgar tongue because it was common, because it was for everybody. So he was translating so that everybody could read their Bible, or at least, all educated elites could read their Bible. And this is what shocked Augustine. He did not use the Septuagint. He didn't use the Greek translation of the Hebrew. He used the Hebrew itself. He studied with rabbis. He carefully attended to ways in which the Hebrew text has what he called the Hebraica Veritas, the Hebrew truth. And he argued very persuasively that there are points at which the Septuagint gets things wrong and the Hebrew manuscripts preserve the true reading. And that his arguments about that are fascinating in and of themselves, but they also contribute to some really lovely little points about the interpretation of Genesis. Again, a short book, a point-by-point commentary, and just really, for me, a thrill to read. Maybe too arcane, I don't know, but that's the runner-up in Best Theology. Congratulations, Dante. Little writer, not too many people have heard of him, but I really think this Dante guy is going places. So now that he's got an Inkling Award, hopefully he'll be more widely known. And that's it. The Inkling Awards of 2025, delivered in 2026. Kind of like the Oscars, looking back on the previous year. And so to close, I just want to mention a few things that I'm excited to read in the future, this year, coming up. This year, I mentioned my rule of reading novels on the weekends last year. And this year, I want to adopt the C.S. Lewis old books rule. And that is that I'm going to, as much as possible, I'm going to read one old book at least for every new modern book that I read. Ideally, I'll read more than one per modern book, but I don't think I read enough old books last year. And C.S. Lewis has this wonderful argument that he makes in his introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation about why we should be reading old books. And it's not just about loving the past or whatever. It's about counterbalancing our chronological blindness. He says there are always characteristic errors of a particular century, the thing about which posterity will ask, but how could they have thought that? None of us can fully escape this blindness, but we shall certainly increase it and weaken our guard against it if we read only modern books. Where they are true, they will give us truths which we half knew already. Where they are false, they will aggravate the error with which we are already dangerously ill. The only palliative is to keep the clean sea breeze of the centuries blowing through our minds, and this can only be done by reading old books. Not, of course, that there is any magic about the past. People were no cleverer then than they are now. They made as many mistakes as we, but not the same mistakes. They will not flatter us in the errors we are already committing, and their own errors, being now open and palpable, will not endanger us. Two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they are unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. To be sure, the books of the future would be just as good a corrective as the books of the past, but unfortunately we cannot get at them. I love that line, the clean sea breeze of the centuries. And I feel that when I read old books. So one thing I definitely want to read this time around this year is a book called the Sefer Yetzirah. It's this canonical, I guess, maybe canonical is the wrong word, but it's the central text of Kabbalah, which is the Jewish mystic tradition. I hear that you have to be 40 or older to read it, so I'm kind of jumping the gun, or you're supposed to be 40 or older to read it, but I will return to it when I am older. But I'm going to read it this year. A couple other things, not necessarily new, or not necessarily old, rather, but I want to read this trilogy on the Cultural Revolution by Frank Dikötter, which I don't know that much about Mao's Cultural Revolution, and I want to know more, and this is a kind of depressing history as I understand it. But I want to get in one big history. And then I'd like to read the complete plays of Tom Stoppard, who died last year. He was a playwright. I love much of his work, especially his play Arcadia. But there's lots that I haven't read, so I'm going to try to read all of his works collected this year. All right, that's about it for me. I'm going to start taking mailbag questions again, so please write in if you've got mailbag questions. The podcast will come out as much as I can make it while I'm teaching. I am going to do my journey through Dante's Divine Comedy with you. I am going to embark on that, like I said I would do. But please bear with me and stick with me. Follow if you haven't already. Subscribe on YouTube or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. So new episodes will come up in your feed as and when I am able to get around to them. I want to make sure I do them justice. I want to make sure I get you the highest quality classical education that you didn't know you were missing. In the meantime, to tide you over, first of all, write to me at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. That's where you can subscribe to my newsletter and get into my DMs and ask me questions that I'll answer on the show or maybe just contemplate and write back to you about. And if you really want to tide yourself over, I've got a new piece on Virgil in First Things. It's on the cover of the February issue, which is out now. And we just did on the show, if you've been following along, we did a long series on Homer and Virgil. And so having completed that, I think you might enjoy reading my take on Virgil and what he has to say for us in America's 250th year, which we are now embarking upon. Kind of crazy to think, and I'm excited to be with you during that. I'm very, very grateful to all of you who listen and subscribe. New listeners, welcome. You're in for a treat, I hope. This has been a wild ride for me. Gosh, I've been doing this since the COVID days, just talking through the best that has been thought and said, reading things together with you. And if you're just as we've been talking about, if you're just getting started in a reading life, one thing that always helps is to read with people. So this is partly for you to have somebody to kind of take you along and read together with. I'm very, very glad that you are here. Don't forget to review, share, subscribe, let people know about the show. That really helps me. Check out my own book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. And spread the word however you can. Rate the podcast 5 stars if you haven't already. That really helps boost me in the algorithm. That's it for now. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.